This time it's 10 flat twin motorcycles that aren't made by BMW. Today the flat twin engine is synonymous with BMW's Boxers, the GS and so on. But they didn't invent the flat twin concept at all. And in fact there have been many companies that produce motorcycles with flat twin engines. And so here is 10 of them. And to make things more interesting, we're also going to exclude bikes that are actually license-built BMWs, things like Zundapps and Nivals. Now the name ABC Motorcycles was actually employed by a few different companies over the years, but for this video we're discussing the ABC motorcycles built by Sopwith Engineering. Sopwith of course being a company very famous for its aircraft during the First World War, such as the Sopwith Pup and the Sopwith Camel. But the problem for the company owner Tommy Sopwith was with the war over, there was no demand for aircraft, so what could you do to keep the factory going? He hit upon the idea of building motorcycles and so approached engineer Granville Bradshaw. Bradshaw was born in Preston in Lancashire in 1887. During the Great War he cut his teeth designing aircraft engines, but would later design a range of motorcycle engines with quite unique features, such as a V-twin for Panther and a range of single-cylinder machines with oil-cooled barrels. He used a number of machines in the interwar period, such as OK Supreme and Zenith. But for ABC, in 1918 he introduced a 400cc flat-twin engine. The engine incidentally could also be used in light aircraft. Many aspects of the 390cc machine were indeed very modern and up-to-date. It was overhead valve, featured leaf spring rear suspension and was fitted with a 4-speed gearbox, all fairly unusual at the time. Build quality was excellent, but the machine was expensive to build, and so unfortunately it was not a success, with ABC going bankrupt in 1923. The Fairy was a small flat twin motorcycle or motorcycle engine built by Light Motors Limited. The company was established by Joseph F. Barter in 1902. He developed a small single-cylinder initial engine intended to fit into the frame of a standard bicycle, and from this he developed a 200cc flat twin engine which he called the Fee, French for Fairy, production of which started in 1905. Shortly after this he would change the name of the machine to the Fairy. And given that it was first designed in 1904, the Fairy or Fee is often seen as the first flat twin motorcycle. Apart from its then unique layout, the engine was fairly typical of the period, with manual oiling, direct drive and automatic inlet over exhaust valve systems. The machine was produced at a rate of around 10 units per week, but this would prove insufficient to keep the company profitable, and by 1907 Fairy was in financial trouble, and so was bought out by the Douglas brothers, whose foundry produced many castings for the engine, which of course moves us smoothly on to the next company on the list. Douglas Motorcycles was established in 1882 by two brothers, William and Edwin, originally performing foundry and blacksmith work, and one of their customers was Joseph Barter. He produced a small lightweight flat twin engine for use in motorcycles, but when the company went bankrupt in 1907, the Douglas brothers swept in and took over. They enlarged Barter's fore and aft flat twin engine out to 350cc and rechristened the motorcycle understandably the Douglas. The Douglas flat twin offered excellent performance for the day and was very popular initially, with a number of machines being sold to the military during the Great War. The company was also heavily involved in competition, claiming their first TT win in 1912 in the lightweight class. Throughout their history, Douglas built almost exclusively flat twin machines. These were usually of 350cc, although some larger models were available, and usually, at least in the early days, the engine was laid out fore and aft, with one cylinder pointing forward and the other pointing backwards towards the wheel. And it was until 1934 and the Endeavour model that they produced their first machine in a more conventional engine orientation, the BMW style with the cylinders sticking out either side. Well, to our modern eyes at least. The Endeavour's engine was a side valve of 494cc and even featured shaft drive. Post-war would see a new range of 350cc flat twins. While these would in some ways resemble the Endeavour, they were very different, featuring chain pile drive instead of the shaft of the Endeavour and using overhead valves. The machines also featured a fairly unique chassis which made use of torsion bar suspension units, front and rear. But this made the machine complex and therefore expensive to manufacture, and Douglas would struggle to turn a profit. Their response would be the Dragonfly. This was a more developed and simplified version of the machine. The chassis was generally more conventional, although it did feature Earl-type front forks. But for me it's the smooth, banana-esque styling that really makes the Dragonfly stand out. But unfortunately it wasn't enough to keep Douglas afloat, with Douglas closing their doors for the final time in 1957. So you want to buy yourself a flat twin that is the complete opposite to a BMW. Well, the Velocette LE could be the ideal motorcycle for you. Sure, it's fitted with a flat twin engine with shaft final drive, but from that point onwards the machine is extremely unusual, making use of water cooling and side valve induction just to keep everything really quiet. The LE, standing for light engine incidentally, was the brainchild of Percy Goodman, and the first engine was of just 150cc. This would later go up to 200cc, and the first models would feature hand crank starting and just 3 gears, also hand selected. Later models would use a 4-speed foot change box. The machine was smooth, quiet and comfortable, but with just 10 horsepower it was fairly sedate too. The chassis featured front and rear suspension with excellent front forks, and the frame was a pressed steel job, which offered pretty good weather protection. But practical as the machine was, it was also rather expensive, so it didn't compete terribly well with those cheap Villiers powered machines that most people were using to work. And of course the unusual styling did put a lot of people off. However, the quiet, efficient little machine did find favour with various police forces in the United Kingdom, remaining in service through until the early 70s. And indeed LE was the last machine to be built at the Velocette factory. The 192cc Velocette Valiant is, not unsurprisingly, an evolution of the earlier LE model, although the LE model would go on to outlive it. The engine differed from the LE in a number of ways. The whole thing was simplified by the use of air cooling, and there was also overhead valves, and compression ratio was raised to 8.5 to 1 as opposed to 7 to 1 of the LE, raising performance to around 12 horsepower. Shaft drive was the same, but the gearbox featured 4 speeds and conventional foot operation. This was later applied to LEs, of course. The engine's bottom end was beefed up to cope with the extra power, but for all that the machine was not a commercial success, being far more expensive than the equivalent Tiger Cub 200. Zundapp was a German company established by Fritz Neumeier in Nuremberg in 1917. Their big twin K series was introduced in 1933. But while the design in some ways does resemble a BMW engine, it's quite different in principle, not making use of the boxer crankshaft layout, and indeed some engineers do consider it a very wide-angle V-twin. Zundapp's K series stretched from 200 to 800cc, making use of a side valve layout. This was until the KS600 of 1938, which used overhead valves on its 597cc engine. During the Second World War, the KS range became Zundapp's equivalent to BMW's R75, being similarly equipped with sidecars. Perhaps their most unusual wartime machine was the K800. This used a unit construction flat 4 engine, not dissimilar to the later Goldwing. Post-war, Zundapp would concentrate their efforts on lightweight motorcycles, microcars and scooters. But while their 2-stroke engines would find success in motocross, the big twins would never reappear in the market. The drive to develop Harley-Davidson's XA model seems curious, because they already built the WA V-twin, but the US military wanted something which more closely resembled the BMW, that is a flat twin with shaft final drive. The machine was inspired by BMW's side valve R71, and did indeed have some advantages over the WLA already in service. For one thing, the engine ran around 38 degrees centigrade or 100 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, and the machine's shaft drive and simple design made maintenance much more straightforward. But the introduction of the Willys Jeep made the XA surplus to requirements, and only around 1,000 were built, many of which would ultimately see service with the Russian army, with overhead valve and cervicar versions being stillborn. The Indian Model O was introduced in 1917 and used a flat twin engine of 257cc. The machine was the work of Charles Franklin and was inspired by the Douglas 350s. Replacing an earlier 2-stroke as the lightest model in Indian's catalogue, the little engine ran a bore stroke of 50.8 by 63.5. There was a 3-speed gearbox mounted below the engine and chain final drive, although top speed was quoted at just 36 miles an hour. The Indian dealers were not keen on the bike at all, although it is said that many lady motorcyclists were. It offered a low centre of gravity and was light and easier to manage. Perversely, this negatively affected sales of the bike, with men describing it as just a girl's bike. Our American misogyny is nothing new. Unfortunately, this all meant that the Model O was not a sales success and was only on the market between 1917 and 1919, making it ironically a rare and collectible bike today. Introduced in 1921, there's no doubt that the Economic was an unusual machine. Sure, there were some fairly common parts on it. Druid forks and the belt final drive were all fairly conventional, but the Economic was one of the first flat twins to feature a crankshaft that ran in line with the frame. An unusually little side valve twin was of just 165 cc's, and even more unusually, the engine was actually American built, not a country generally associated with flat twin engines. And the transmission system was similarly unusual, making use of a lined wheel rim which ran in contact with the face of the engine flywheel, and a lever by the rider's left knee could be used to disengage and of course engage drive, while a lever by his right knee selected the gears. And from the gearbox, drive was taken to the rear wheel by a rawhide belt, which at least was more conventional, if a little old-fashioned it has to be said by 1921. By this time most machines had moved over onto all-chain drive. The resultant machine was underpowered and overly complicated. Not surprisingly then, not a commercial success, with production ending in 1923. Introduced in 1964, there is little doubt that the Marusho ST500 is fairly closely based on BMWs of the time. The little engine ran overhead valves and had a bore and stroke of 68 by 68. Compression ratio was around 8 to 1, and the machine was claimed at around 35.6 horsepower at 8,000 rpm for the touring models, with around 38 horsepower for the more sporty Magnum, rising to a claimed 40 horsepower in 1966. There was 4-speed transmission and shaft final drive. The final model was the 1967 Electra. This model featured a number of improvements, including of course electric starting, but that was the end of the line, and the promised 600 and 750s never appeared. Well, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.